It demands that we tell sinners the whole truth.
We will not go quietly into the night.
Voice of truth says this is for my glory.
Christian Cornerstone Podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the Christian Cornerstone Podcast, everyone. Yours truly, Mr. Bill Ricksecker. Joining us as well is Michael White. We are going through the 52 greatest stories of the Bible. And if you have not been following along, these are not necessarily all 52 of the Bible. There are, in fact, a lot more. But I've had this book for quite a few years, and we've been going over this year, 2024. It's been really exciting. There is so much, I promise you, so much we have to discuss throughout each episode. We've got limitations, unfortunately. We are going through Exodus chapter 1 through 14 this week, and we are talking about Moses, his upbringing, his journey, his calling, and the birth of the nation Israel. So, Michael, how are things going?
Pretty good. Not as bad weather-wise as I'm sure things have been over where you're at, right?
You know, actually, I was bragging to a friend of mine. They're over near the Chicago area, Crown Point, Indiana, which, if I remember right, because they yelled at me last year, I rode my motorcycle to Chicago to see my uncle and then came home, and somewhere in between the travel coming home and coming home itself, I'm getting a text message saying something. It was like, hey, why didn't you come say hi to me or something like that? I don't remember exactly what was said. And I was like, well, so that's my plan this year. I'm gonna go do that and, kind of make up for it. But they apparently had some snow, more than we've had. And I looked at the weather. It is actually a lot warmer. Right now it's 32 degrees where I'm at. Compared to, I think it was maybe last week, maybe the week before, it was literally a total ice age. And I think I shared some pictures with you about that. This, it's like in the negative digits with the wind chill. But thankfully, I think we're done, and I really hope we're done. The 45-day forecast on my app basically says high 30s, mid 40s for the next 45 days. So I'm crossing my fingers, hoping that's the case. But, I'm super excited about that. It's like, yay, no more winter gear. So we are past that.
For sure. And I can go ahead and jump into, well, I guess for the listeners, we're trying out a new outline for the show. So you will have to let us know, as Bill says, how do you like it? But I'll go ahead and start off giving you guys a short description. I mean, this one, 1 through 14, I was reading through it. I split it up in like 2 to 3 days because I was like, man, some of these chapters are long. But for your listening pleasure, just to make sure we get everything in there, excuse me, I will go ahead and just kind of run through the chapters. They get shorter as we get to the plagues at the end, so don't worry about it. I'll just run through that, and then Bill will take it from there and dive in deep with what we're going to talk about for kind of the majority of the episode. So if you're ready, here we go. Chapter 1, we have the Israelites oppressed in Egypt. Joseph and his whole generation died. A new Pharaoh came in. They didn't remember him. And meanwhile, guess what? The Israelites are multiplying and are fruitful. Basically, they're having a lot of babies. And Egypt did not like that. They were like, there's too many of them. They're going to come against us in a war. So they started making them slaves. They oppressed them. And then the funny part, Israel kept having more babies. So more and more. And then that leads Pharaoh to saying, kill every baby boy that is born. Chapter 2, Moses is born. He's found by Pharaoh's daughter after he's put in the Nile in a basket. He was able to be raised by his own mom. And then as soon as he was old enough, sent back to Pharaoh's daughter, became part of their family and household. Also, we skip ahead in that same chapter because guess what? Moses is grown up and he kills an Egyptian. He then flees to Midian. Chapter 3, we have the burning bush. God charges him to bring the Israelites out of Egypt. Chapter 4, signs from Moses to give the Egyptians. If you remember, that's the snake, the rod turning into a snake, the hand with leprosy, the blood in the Nile, all of that good stuff. In that chapter also, Aaron joins
blood in the Nile is good stuff?
No, none of it's good. It just gets worse. But the whole show, or like the whole time I'm reading, I'm thinking back to the Prince of Egypt, the movie, the cartoon. And I'm like, I remember this in the movie. I remember this in the movie. Oh man. But Aaron joins the scene. Then chapter 5, bricks without straw. the Israelites become more oppressed. And it's just kind of a battle throughout a lot of this of the Israelites. I mean, they just complain like crazy, like, why are you doing this? Now they're becoming even more mean and they're making us do even more work. And then Pharaoh's saying, you guys are just lazy, which I loved reading that. Like, he's like, you guys are lazy. If you have time to complain, you're lazy. Chapter 6, though, God promises delivery, and you get a family record of Moses and Aaron. 7, Aaron is to speak for Moses. His staff becomes a snake, eats up the other magician's snake. And then, guess what? We have our first plague, the blood in the Nile. Chapter 8, our plagues are the frogs, gnats, and flies. 9 is livestock, boils, and hail. 10, locusts and darkness. 11, the firstborn being killed. 12, we have the Passover, the Exodus, Passover restrictions. 13, consecration of the firstborn crossing the Red Sea. And then 14, closing it out with more of crossing the Red Sea. And then that's where the Lord saves Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And then, quoting from my NIV Bible, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. Whoa. So it's kind of a lot there, but Bill, where do we start and dive in from there?
Well, as you were reading through that, I was thinking, his job is really going to suck if there's a devotional where there's more than just those 14 chapters.
I was hoping there wouldn't be. I was like, 14. I mean, next week is one chapter. So I was like,
yeah,
it'll be like 30 seconds. This is what happened. But maybe not.
And I haven't looked ahead of that. I'm a little curious, maybe that, because it seems to be kind of, so far, we've only gotten through, what was fourth week, fifth week?
Week 4, yeah.
Week 4? Okay, so we've got 4 that we've gone through so far, and it seems, so far, those 4, it seems to be that process. The first week, we're going to go through 1 chapter. The second week, we're going to go through 20 chapters. Next week, we're going to go through just 1 chapter, which was Abraham. And then guess what? We're in Exodus. We're going through 14 chapters. So, yeah, and then obviously next week itself is Exodus chapter 20. So, I don't know, maybe it gives you a little bit of vacation every week, every other week. So, yeah, there's a lot there, and there's a piece here that I was curious about. Let me actually look at this outline, because let's try to get into this. Okay, this is time for Bill to go into deep with those chapters. I like that too, and I think you actually put a little Michael emphasis on that. Yeah, there is a lot here. The piece that I want to focus on, and Michael, I believe I shared this with you, was the excuses we make. But before we get into that, let me actually go through some of this commentary, because there's 400 years that have passed from the time of Israel entering Egypt to this new Pharaoh. Pharaoh's something to do with animals.
Bunch of cats, feral cats.
Yeah.
Well, they worship the cats, right? Or something with cats.
Okay, so maybe as a feral, I can't even say that.
Feral cat.
Feral, yeah, that too. So yeah, 400 years have passed. This new Pharaoh, and what I thought was interesting, you mentioned that this Pharaoh didn't know Joseph. Joseph died in about 1635 BC. Moses was born 1550 BC, so this is about 64 years. And I think I did approximately, because there was a couple different sources I saw that gave about 5 to 10 year difference, which is understandable. We don't have his birth certificates. But so the question, and basing Moses' number, 64, the 64-year gap, you would factor in, I would probably guess, maybe a couple years from, and I haven't looked this up, but maybe a couple years from the time this new Pharaoh comes into play to the time where Moses is born. So we'll call it a safe 60 years as an example. Mm-hmm. That's really not enough time for somebody not to know somebody else, such as Pharaoh not knowing Joseph. So I remember this years ago, and actually, okay, we have it here in the commentary notes. I was curious. I was like, what do you mean he didn't know? And my initial thoughts, this was far before I've dived into this, study of, having actually a study Bible, and, reading some more into it. I was thinking, it's like, well, maybe he just didn't recognize his authority. And that part's actually true. No, I'm sorry. That actually came later. When I first thought, it's like, okay, maybe so much time has happened. Joseph, he didn't know Joseph, but he is clearly able to know Joseph within 64 years. They've probably got their scrolls and tablets, paintings. Joseph's tomb is there or something like that. Whatever else is going on. So there's some sort of recognition. But for Pharaoh not to know Joseph, here's what Constable has to say about this. The implication of the statement that Pharaoh did not know Joseph in the Hebrew text is that he did not know him because he did not want to know about him. And it seems that early kings in the 18th dynasty, which is when this is taking place, the 18th dynasty wanted to solidify control of Egypt in the hands of the native Egyptians. After a long period of control by foreigners, they did not want to acknowledge the greatness of Joseph, who was, of course, also a foreigner and a Semite. Now, what I think is interesting about this is, okay, we don't want to recognize how did he have it worded here? Did not want to know him. Hands of Egypt, long period. I completely overlooked. Okay, just in general, it says here that he did not want to know him. So, I mean, that's a lot of implications right there, is because he's there, he's known, people are probably still talking about him. We obviously weren't there thousands of years ago. But he's not wanting to be known to solidify this power, but it shows me that really the wickedness of the Pharaoh himself. Joseph's built a reputation. He saved a lot of people from famines, so this is be clearly known. But this Pharaoh's like, no, I don't care to know anything about him. Don't give me his track record. Don't tell me his accomplishments. I don't even care. I know he was second in command of Egypt, but I don't even care about that. As far as I'm concerned, he's old news. We're going to start something new. We're going to build a new empire. But I think that's really one of the pitfalls there, is because what I see from that, and when you look at throughout Exodus, we see the character of this Pharaoh, was that he was very bitter and very hard-hearted, and he was just power-hungry. And so he's already decided, prior to coming into Egypt, I'm not going to recognize somebody who knows how to run a kingdom. I'm not going to recognize somebody who cares for the people. I'm not even going to recognize somebody who's a man of God. So these are just some of the things I've really thought about. And one of the things I think we miss when we go back, when we read this, we get this mindset that pharaohs or the Egyptian nation itself was always ruthless. And you see this kind of played off in some of these movies. But I actually can't remember for the life of me where I read this from. The Egyptian pharaohs were actually really nice guys, with the exception of this guy here. There's been a bunch of archaeological discoveries found where people are writing in their various ways. I can't remember exactly what, but they're basically affirming these things which they're building, the pyramids and whatever else is over there, that during the time of the construction, these slaves were recognizing, long live the pharaoh. So the pharaohs themselves were not really that bad of people. They were, taking care of all the Egyptians. They were taking care of the Jews at this point in time. But it isn't until this guy comes into play, brand new Egyptian pharaoh, brand new dynasty, and my commentary actually says that this was some foreign power. So I don't personally know enough about this history to affirm how it would have happened, but it's believed that a group of people called the Hyksos, if I'm pronouncing that right, is where this is coming from. So not only did he not want to know who Joseph was, but also this is a foreign power coming in to take over Egypt at this time, it's understandable that he doesn't know who Joseph is, because he's from a completely different people.
Yeah, the notes in my Bible said that he didn't know the great blessing he had been to Egypt, and probably how God had been blessing him directly, which then was directly blessing the whole nation who was helping all these other nations. Because you see that, I think back in Genesis, because in my Bible church reading, I'm still stuck in Genesis, so it's very weird to we skipped so much. The devotional, I'm like, why are they talking about Joseph? Wait, we're at Moses. Wait, Joseph was before. So it's a little confusing, but all these foreign kings understood with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. They're like, we know your God is the God who has blessed you, who is bringing,
Right.
you know, like pray on our behalf or take these riches, and they won't do it. But, you know, all these people understood. So that I think goes in line with what you're saying of like this new person comes in, doesn't want anything to do with the foreign, these foreign Jewish Semitic people that like, I'm the Pharaoh, this is my kingdom now, and overlooking that. How did Egypt get so good during this time? Like, why was it? It wasn't just because they were good or that their false gods were, you know, praying to all these. It's because God was blessing them.
Yeah, and that's really something to recognize too, because as we get into Moses, I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to try to keep on track with these notes. I remember last time I was scrolling backwards. Nope, we talked about that. So I don't want to get through that again.
We're on
But
track.
Moses,
Yeah.
Yeah, for now. We'll lose track here in a minute. So, I mean, that's very a significant piece. But as Moses comes into play, and I shared this with you last week, and I thought this was interesting. Like, I actually had a friend of mine that I shared this with, another friend. I shared this with. It's like, hey, you know, something I really never really clicked was Moses was a Levite priest. Like, and they were kind of like saying, it's like, you know, Billy, what's going on? You should know this. And it's like, well, every time I read this, it's like, I'm not looking, and this is how I am throughout all the reading of the Bible. I'm not specifically focused on who's a Levite or the bloodlines themselves. So like Moses, when I'm reading this, I'm thinking, okay, he's a Jew in Egypt. He's a prince, so to speak. And I really just kind of look at the character and the cultural upbringing. And also, I think maybe as a side piece, one of the reasons why I might not have seen that or might not have clicked was because it's only mentioned in the one verse, verse 1. And then we have very little information about Moses' upbringing. It's, okay, Moses was born. Oh,
Skip ahead.
Yeah. So,
which when you had said that to me, I was like, oh yeah, I didn't realize it. But then when I was reading through the Bible, I was like, well, I knew Aaron was, but then Aaron was his brother, so it makes sense Moses was too, because all throughout they're going to Aaron, make the golden calf, do this for us, and then he has sons that were supposed to take over, and I think those two sons get killed, right? There is like they do something bad. So it was all piecing them like, oh, I knew all of that, but I didn't combine like they were brothers. So therefore, if Aaron is from the Levi tribe, then,
so it was Moses.
He's your brother. Yeah. Because like you said, they don't really focus on that because that's Aaron's thing. Moses is the leader.
Right. Well, and what we have here, what I think is interesting about Moses, is like we said, it starts with the birth. Okay, 40 years later, welcome to the club, Moses. Let's tell a little bit more about your story. But MacArthur, by the way, a little curious, what kind of study Bible do you have? Like
it's the NIV.
Just an NIV study Bible, or you got like little footnotes kind of thing, or?
Yeah, usually like half of it's a Zondervan NIV study Bible.
Okay, I was just a little curious because you've talked about my notes and all that, and it's like I'm a little curious.
Early 2000s.
2000. Well, that's
Early
a little
2000s.
It'll keep it as long as you can. I actually have this is my second study. We're getting off track.
Now online NIVs. I'm like, this is not NIV, but yeah, keep going.
It's not mine.
MacArthur.
MacArthur notes this about Moses, that because Moses was brought up in Egypt, he would have obviously learned how to be an Egyptian, would have led in various ways. But he says this: Moses would have learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, or perhaps one or more languages of Canaan. And he would have participated in various outdoor sports such as archery, horseback riding, which were two of the favorites of the 18th dynasty. Now, I read that and I was thinking, because how I'll talk about that here in a little bit, but with his commentary, it really helped to get a better understanding of who Moses was. Because I always thought, okay, yeah, he was a prince, he was part of Egypt, that's it. And then, so he has this sense of leading people, but MacArthur throwing this concept in here, and obviously he's got more skilled, more historical understanding and everything than I do. But it was really interesting because this really helped me to piece together the character of Moses in a better light. And so he learned reading, learned writing. Those are the two that are really sticking out to me right now.
But not public speaking.
Yeah, right? I didn't even think about that.
I had to throw that in there. I was like, MacArthur knows that too, because We're going to see the whole time, I cannot speak. I cannot say my words.
Yeah.
But he could write them. So, yeah.
Right. Well, and that's even a really good piece. And before we get off track even more, there's a documentary by Patterns of Evidence. You might know about them because they're either affiliated with, supported by, their product is sold by Answers in Genesis and at their museums and all that. But Patterns of Evidence has a documentary called The Moses Controversy. And apparently, I personally never heard of this, but apparently there's people out there that question the 5 books of the Bible. Did Moses actually write these? So he goes off and explains, well, this is how he could have written it. So, which I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm just going to promote that documentary. It's a great documentary. And we'll just I'm going to keep going on here. So he was really a noble man. And we see that Moses was a noble man because he stands up for the oppressed in chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. And then again for a woman in verse 17. Did I say chapter 12 and 13? Chapter 2.
Chapter 2, yeah.
Did I? Okay, yes. Chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. And then again in verse 17. So it really shows that he's not really this stuck-up guy. I mean, he learned, whether, his mom smacked him in the face a couple times, beat his butt, whatever it is, Moses, you know better. He was a man of good character. So that's one of the things we can pull from this as far as who he was. But, I mean, this entire story, they have it titled, and I was thinking about this. I was like, throughout this week, I was like, they have it titled as A Birth of a Nation, which is true. And then one of the pieces that I wanted to focus on is, and I think they really work together in harmony, is, and we shared this before, or I've shared this with you, and we'll go over this here in a minute, is years ago I had to write up a sermon for my degree course. So this is one I put together, and it's about the excuses in which Moses makes. But what I think is really the harmony behind these two is there's a promise of a nation that God promised Abraham years ago, and now it's finally come to fruition. But what's interesting is God's response to that, or Moses' response to that, when God says, hey, I need you to go. But before we get into that, I'm curious, is there any thoughts, Michael, that you have prior to those chapters that lead up to that? Actually, what takes place in 14, I believe. No, not 14, chapter 4.
Yeah, I was like, that's too far. You skipped to the end. I think maybe what I'm realizing now, like as you're talking to that, maybe a lot of people didn't realize was he was like in poverty, but then he got this royal, so he was set up to be, like if you were a prince of Egypt or a son of Pharaoh's daughter of like the lineage, they're preparing you to be a leader of this great nation of Egypt. Right. And God still uses him as a great leader, but it's kind of taken him back to the poverty. Like they're going to be in a desert. And because of the Israelite sins, because he hits the rock when he could have just spoken to the rock, he's not going to see the promised land. Like there's so much, but God still uses him. And I think that's really cool, even for our own lives, of seeing like we can be prepared for certain things. And like maybe he was thinking, I'm going to be a great Jew who's an Egyptian and I'm going to lead. And then no, you're not going to be, but God still prepared him. And so I think that's really cool for us to see too, that I haven't really thought about before, of like, God has his own plan, and that's kind of what the devotional talks about. And like, he's going to use us in his own timing, and we may think we're going one way, and he's like, nope, we're going to go. Right. We're going to have you crossing the Red Sea, and then have all these people that you need to lead in the desert, and then you're all going to die in the desert. Yeah. But I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to be faithful, and all of that.
And I think that's really, a big thing that, I mean, to Moses' benefit, and we'll deal with this up until, actually, what do we go? I think Numbers is what I said. So we've got a couple episodes until we've got a little bit more of a foundations of who God is, because Moses' understanding of who God is limited to Joseph, it's limited to Jacob, it's limited to Isaac, it's limited to Abraham and what he's heard. And now, granted, this has been about I think we're 3,000, what would you say, 1600, is that what I said, is when Moses was born? 1550. Okay, 1550. It was about 4000 BC is when when everything was created. So he's got about 3,000 years, 2,500, right? Yeah, 2.5. Yeah, that's about right. Yeah. So he's got 2,500 years of history, which at the same time is fairly limited, because from what we know about God, to our best understanding, is what they know about God. Unless they had some, drawings or stories that they just told each other at night before they went to bed or something. But so as far as we are aware of, Moses had a limited understanding of who God is. So for God to really come out of the blue and, light a bush on fire and say, "Hey, Moses, what's up? I need you to come do something for me." I mean, you can kind of understand this. I mean, he's grown up in Pharaoh's court, being trained to lead a people, even leading peoples. Probably, I'm guessing at this point, he probably was a general of the army or something like that. So, I mean, he's got the skills to be a leader. And then God, like you said, it's like, Moses, you're done working for Egypt. You're gonna lead a people, but it's not gonna be those guys. I've got something else in mind.
And maybe also why he's so comfortable, because you'll see in these, he goes back to the palace, where I think of that, I'm like, I would be terrified. Like, he's afraid to speak, but I would be, how do you know how to get into the palace? Like, he most likely was staying right nearby the palace, or even when they say kicked out, I'm like, did they really? Because then they're like, draw him back. If I see him, I will kill him, and then bring him back. So, like, even that alone of, like, he was comfortable enough to know how to deal with the officials, and that was like a big part of, he grew up there.
Yeah. And and that's one of the things I'm curious is he's already got a bounty on his head after he kills the 2 Egyptians. So going back, and we'll talk about this here in a bit, but he had to deal with the confidence in God. It's like, I'm going back. There is a bounty on my head. If I walk into the palace, they're going to kill me right there. But he still does this anyways, and we'll find out here in Genesis chapter 4. Let's actually jump there. Genesis chapter 4. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think, though, what I remember reading that God had told him, those people that were coming after you have died. Oh, you're right on that. You're right. I can't find. So I was trying to look for him. Like, I don't know, but I remember reading that too, of being like, well, that might have been a little bit helpful. But you still have the Israelites who, when they kind of mocked him, saying, "What, are you going to kill us too?" Like, I'm sure he was a story for,
right?
Like, we had one of us that made it up there, and then he ran away, and we don't know what happened.
We almost succeeded. We were almost free, but then it just kind of fell apart.
Yeah, but chapter 4, you're saying.
Yep. It's a good reputation. It's like, hey guys, it's been 40 years and I'm back. So yeah, in 40 years, no, in chapter 4, not 40. Chapter 4, I got to get this in my mind because I keep wanting to go back to 40 and 14. We don't, it's a single digit. So he's dealing with, what do we have here? I got this open. Moses answered again, if they did, okay, so God has already come to him with this burning bush. There's already this conversation in Genesis chapter 3. I'm scrolling back here. I got it. Okay, that actually brought me back to 4. Okay, so the call, period of time, yes, the king of Egyptian, this is verse 23 of chapter 2. He's died. The people are groaning, the slave labor, they're tired. And keep in mind, this is still the brand new king, or Pharaoh, more or less. So this is a new slave labor than what they originally were a part of. And it totally sucks for various reasons. But Moses is out tending the flock, and then he's seeing this bush that's not even burning up. In chapter 3, verse 2, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire within the bush, and he looked, and the bush was ablaze and fire. It was not being consumed. And that alone would be a sight to see. And I think there would have to be, don't know what kind of time period passed, but I don't know, maybe he's thinking, I'm delusional, the heat's getting to me, something. But then at the same time, it's like, this bush is going for a really long time. Maybe it's just like, a rich source. Maybe it's like so flooded with moisture that it's not consuming it. And I'll be completely honest, if I saw something like that, I'd be a little curious. And, wondering what's going on. So he turns to this, and then God comes and he says, Moses, Moses, and Moses says, "Here I am. Do not approach any closer. Your sandals, take your sandals off. This place you are standing is holy ground." So, and then he says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and God of Jacob." So Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So this really shows that he had some sort of reputation, some sort of understanding who God was. And this burning bush is identifying itself. I am who I am. Spoiler alert. I am the God that you heard of who followed Abraham, that's me. The God that you heard of that followed Isaac, that's me. Oh, and Jacob, that was my doing too. And it's not in here, but do you remember Joseph? Yeah, he was me too. Well, not remember, but heard of him. So there's a lot of affirmation of what God is doing, and he's calling him out to rescue these people, to come to deliver them from the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up from the land into a beautiful place that's flowing with the milk and honey. This is in verse 8. So there's this dialogue that's happening, and I want to pull out my notes before I kind of get ahead of this. What I think is rather interesting, let me actually try to read this word for word. There's let me get back here. Okay, so Moses is a man who spends 40 years growing up in the land of Egypt. He goes from being this high princely position to a very lowly shepherd. From defending Egypt to defending sheep. And he goes from living as royalty to living off the land. And 40 years ago, Moses killed an Egyptian, which we've mentioned. Bounty was put on his head. As a result, he ran far off to the Midian, which is modern-day Saudi Arabia. He spent some time there getting to know the land, learning how to herd the flocks of sheep. He got married, he had a son, and throughout the past 40 years, God has been really using this to prepare Moses for this greater calling. He's no longer going to be a shepherd of the flock of sheep, but he's now going to be commissioned to be a shepherd of the flock of Israel. Now, that itself is really profound. He's spending 40 years in the wilderness before God calls him. And I think this is really something, I titled this sermon actually, God's Calling in Our Excuses. And I think this is really the hindrance there is God is calling Abraham to lead a people, and he's saying is like, well, I'm not qualified. And we'll talk about this here in a minute. But he's talking about how he's not qualified, but God is the one who qualified him. It's like, Moses, throughout these 40 years, you've been tending these sheep. You know the lay of the land. You know where the sharp rocks are. You know where the soft bed of sand is, or whatever specifically it would have looked like. You know where the water flows are, where you guys can rest, you can bathe, you can get some stuff to drink, and so on. You're the guy that I want. You're the guy that I've already chosen before you had any say in this. So he's going off on this, and he knows that if he goes back, he will be killed. Quite possibly could be killed. And he's literally at this point in time when God is saying, go back to Egypt, he's one man. Aaron hasn't even come into the picture just yet. So in his mind, this task really seems to be completely impossible. And in going back to chapter 3, verse 11, we hear him say, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" And then God goes ahead and he affirms, this is who I am. But this really isn't enough. In verse, what do I have here? Verse 4 of chapter 4. I got to scroll down here. The Lord said to Moses, this is after he's starting to make excuses. The Lord appeared, the Lord says to him, oh, here we go, verse 1. Moses answered, if they do not believe me or pay attention, what's going to happen? Because at this point, he's just been said, go back to Egypt. Okay, well, what if they don't believe that, you, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, God of Abraham, so on, that you're the one that commissioned me to do this? It's like, well, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do. So in verse 3, throw the snake on the throw your staff on the ground, throws it on the ground, becomes a snake. Moses freaks out.
My favorite part. Then he ran from it. I'm like, is this a scream? Like the little girl screams, ah, and runs away because he's been shepherding. He knows, right, like that, or it was a really scary snake because most people, like when you hear about David and like these shepherds were tough. Like they would fight bears and lions and coyotes and wolves, all of these with their hands, probably snakes too. So this time when I read it, and he ran from it. And God's like, just grab its tail, buddy. Come on.
Well, and I was going to make a comment on that perhaps that it was just because it was some sort of divine miracles. I mean, this was literally a piece of wood, and now it's a snake. It's like, holy cow. But at the same time, which we find later in the text, when he goes back to Pharaoh, I can't remember what they're called. The charlatans, we'll just call them charlatans. The charlatans and the fakes, they go ahead and do the same thing. It's like, oh yeah, we can do that too. So I think there would have been some knowledge to the sleight of hand kind of concept that they might have done. I personally don't think it was. I think it was, demonically supernatural stuff that they were messing with. So, I mean, it makes me wonder. I mean, I think it's probably just because it was a surprise. I mean, he's just told, throw a stick on the ground, and it turns into a snake. I mean, that alone is enough to freak you out. But regardless, if it was because it was a literal snake, and holy cow, that thing's huge, like the Anaconda movies, or, whatever the reason is. I mean, he's freaking out. And what do we have here? Oh, I'm actually skipping ahead on these verses. So,
which is probably good. Good
right.
for the timing.
Actually, yeah, good point. Very good
Keep
point.
it going, Bill.
Very good point. I'll skip ahead. So, anyways, I'll try to sum this up, because what do I have here for this sermon? I got 4 pages here, so I'm just going to give you the cliff notes. So, in verse 3 and 4, there's a transforming the staff the staff transforms into a serpent. The serpent was a common symbol of the deadly power of Egyptian hand. It also had been alluding to the satanic power behind the Egyptian gods. Now, I don't know how to pronounce this, but there's an Egyptian god, Nebku. We'll just go with that. This was originally the so-called original snake of Egyptian mythology, according to Wikipedia, and was believed to be both an ancient and eternal god. Although he occasionally represented himself or as his son Serket and some other Egyptian god I can't pronounce, or Geb, it's sometimes believed to emerge from the earth and was believed to have lived in the great temple of Heliopolis, which was also at the center of worship for Ra and Atum. So this was a powerful deity. This is one of the head deities, considerably powerful. And one gentleman writes that, Richard Wilkinson writes that after he swallows 7 cobras, or credits to his demonic origins to the snake-like qualities. I missed that. Credits to his demonic origins, snake-like qualities, after he swallows 7 cobras in a myth. Oh, the Egyptian god. Okay. Sorry, I was thinking Richard Wilkins was swallowing 7 cobras. I was like,
Crazy, man.
What's going on here? So
if you want to become an expert, go out and start eating snakes.
Right. Yeah. So, anyways, this Egyptian god cannot be harmed by magic, according to mythology, fire or water. And an early myth demonstrates the ability to breathe fire. This Egyptian god first appears in Egypt's text, in the pyramid text, and is described as an evil, long-winded serpent devouring human souls in the afterlife. Leviticus 17 tells us that these so-called false gods were goat demons. Or it says specifically, they shall no more sacrifice their sacrifices to goat demons, whom they whore after, which is another one. Khnum, goat head god / guardian, which was the source of the Nile and the creator of the children. So for God to say that it was a goat demon really kind of goes to point to the fact that all these gods, which obviously would have been demons as we know, which is a whole nother story. I would encourage you to look at that, you listeners. Each one of the plagues is somehow affiliated with one of these false gods of Egypt. And the short version is, throughout all of these plagues, God is saying, I'm bigger, I'm better, I'm stronger, I'm more powerful than any of these gods that Egypt worships, which is an entire series of its own. But, so the staff transformation is an affirmation that Moses has the power over demons, or more specifically, he's got the power on his side, that it has the power over demons. The leprous hand in 6 and 7 is the authority over afflictions and healing sicknesses and so on. And then in 8 and 9, power over gods. The Nile believed to be the source of life and goodness of the land. This is their ultimate source. Osiris was one of the gods of the Nile. So he's basically saying, like, Moses is basically walking into Pharaoh's court with these things and saying, anything you can do, I can do better. Any strength you have, I'm stronger. I just made that up. That was very terrible. So it really was. I was trying to go with that whole song. Anything you can do, I can do better. It's like, okay, let's put strength in there. And it didn't really work out.
Yes, I can. No, you can. Yes, I can.
Yes, I can. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot there to that. And what Moses is doing is what I think the struggle here is, and I think this is really what keeps us, because years ago, and I actually shared this in the introduction of this text here, is I actually had a mentality. Well, there's actually a couple experiences now that I can think of it. But I thought years ago of, God, I don't have time for this, of, to pursue ministry or to even develop right and so on, because I have so much going on. I mean, I just, in general, a busy life, and even still do. But I remember I was actually praying at that time. I was praying for somebody else. It's like they're saying, it's like, well, I don't have time. And then basically came to bite me in the butt. I'm praying for somebody else, and God's giving me a reality check. It's like, dude, you need to eat those words.
Not snakes, words.
Right. Eat the words, not the snakes. But I think this, and Moses here, he's trying to really come up with an excuse. I'm not qualified. I'm terrified. They want to kill me. I can't talk well. All sorts of different excuses. And then God is saying, is like, I've got your back. You think you can't do something? I can do it better. You're going to be God. And that's who he was. His role and Aaron's role in this was God is playing the representative of God. No, Moses is playing the representative of God. Aaron is playing the representative as a prophet, which by comparison would be us today. But he has all of these things at his disposal. And I mean, it makes me wonder is like what kind of excuses we make, and what's really preventing us from living our purpose-driven life. I'm not really a big Rick Warren fan, but the title itself just kind of came to my mind. So I apologize if those who are opposed to Rick Warren. I'm with you, but I feel really bad for that. I really do. It's like that's really the best that I could come up with.
Fulfilling God's plan for your life.
Yeah, fulfilling. There we go. That's actually
straight out of the notes you got there.
Yeah, fulfilling God's plans for our lives. But I wonder this is what the potential consequences I would have is what would happen if we don't act like Moses. If he didn't do all of these things, what are some of the risks that would happen? Now, I have some here, Michael. I think you have those on hand, those notes.
The sermon that you were going through.
Oh yeah. Go ahead and go to page 3. Share some of those. What? I guess I'm kind of cheating here. I'm asking you a question and giving the answers. I mean, what's I love podcasting. I read some of those, share them, or if you have something else that you want to share. I guess what it comes down to is, what if we say no, or with God's calling for our lives, what if we say, I'll do it in 5 years?
Yeah, so some of what you have there, like the excuses we make can risk destruction. So that's something that is possible. It can hinder our growth. It can impact others and prevent blessings. And I think all of those are really great because it really makes you stop and think of, like, first we have the more of the negative,
right.
You're going to be destroyed. And then you can't grow. And as humans, we want to grow, like you should want to grow. And our bodies are growing, so everything should be growing. And then it turns from like inside, so you've just maybe destroyed yourself. And then not destroyed, you can't grow. Then it's impacting others around you. And that's always a big thing. And then preventing blessings, like why would you ever want to do that? And I think
Right.
that's what people forget, is that when, especially at church, you hear old people talk about the blessings God has done in their lives. And I think that's why it is so impactful to pass down like when he's saying the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob, has all of those connotations, like they've grown up with that. And same when we go to church and you hear this old person, you're like, you can barely walk, you can do, like, we forget that they have seen 80 years of God's blessings in their life,
Right.
or whenever they've turned to it. And I think that is always encouraging for me when you hear people, or at memorials or funerals, when they are Christians, and seeing the blessings that God has done in their lives is very like, whoa, why would I want to stop that?
Yeah.
Like,
And I think we really take the elder people for granted sometimes. I mean, I don't conversate too many. I mean, I have like a small social circle, church and school, church and work. Okay, there's quite a few old people at church, but so yeah, I had to correct myself there. But I mean, as far as like personal dialogue, like, I mean, the only people I can think of is my two grandfathers. They both passed since then, but you know, some of the things one of my grandfathers shared with me were so cool, and I wish we could have had more conversations. My other grandfather, he's a man I'm basically the spitting image of. And even, you know, he's passed away, but I still look up to this man. I mean, I think all the time is just how much I look up to him, because he was in my eyes, and I know every man, woman, and child has sins, but this was the most righteous man I've ever met. And I loved hearing all sorts of stories that he would tell me and, you know, learn from. And him and my grandmother, who's passed as well, you know, just learning from him. You know, he would say, is like, well, you know, me and your grandma had this, or, you know, whatever it is, happened years ago before you were born, you know, whatever the story is. And I'm just like, man, you know, there's a lot that you can learn. And through that, I mean, I think that's really one of the blessings that we have, you know, is the older generation has those 80 some odd years, but then they also have 80, not only in their own experiences, but they have 80 years, you know, such as a Christian who's been studying the Word of God, living out the faith. They've got 80 years of studying the Bible. They've got not only their own study, but they also have tacked on to what they have studied, the people who've taught them, and so on. So basically, they literally have 4,000 years of Bible knowledge, more or less. Which, now that I think about that, that'd be really impressive. Go to somebody that knows 4,000 years. But yeah, I mean, these hinder our growth in different ways, because if we don't take these challenges, such as Moses, if he wouldn't have acted, he'd still be out and about tending sheep. He would not know really the strength that he truly had, you know, the abilities that he's learned over the past 40 years if he didn't act. They impact others in ways, you know, such as this. If he chose not to act, hypothetically speaking, I don't think it would necessarily be true, but hypothetically speaking, the slave would still stay in Egypt. Pharaoh would still be in power. I'm wondering, at this point in time, I'm really wondering if that was the case, what kind of authoritative power would Egypt have? Like, how big would the empire be, or when would it have officially ended, and so on. And yeah, the preventing the blessings, because, you know, everybody has some sort of gift, everybody has some sort of calling on our lives. Moses was called to bring birth to a nation. And if we don't fulfill what God has called us to, we are not only preventing our own blessings, but we're preventing the blessings of others. You know, there's somebody out there that's, let's say for an example, I was talking to you beforehand. Actually, I don't think I shared this with you. Maybe. I'm working on, I decided to go ahead and start writing up a course over Romans. And hypothetically, it's done. It's not, but it's done. I've got all the information there, everything I could possibly give you on the book of Romans. There's somebody out there that's questioning, what is the gospel? How do I articulate the gospel? You know, and which is at the core of what the book of Romans is. And if that piece was not there, I mean, they'd be searching for somebody else. I mean, there's plenty of other people, of course, that have come out with resources, but, you know, let's just say hypothetically, that was the only one that they had access to. by me not personally acting, by me not pursuing what I feel God has called me to, then I've ultimately stunted the growth of this individual. And the same thing can go with, charity. You've got somebody who's hungry. You've got the means. You've got, I don't know, a couple $100, whatever it might be, whatever's in your pocket. You've got the means to support somebody, even giving them lunch, whatever that is, $5-10. They've been praying for this. By you not acting, you're limiting God's blessing on their lives. God has wanted to use you, but now he can't, or now he's not, and so on. And the excuses can go so far. I mean, I think we come back to them throughout our entire lives. I would say here that we really have too many excuses. Let me read this. There's a quote here. We burden to pray. Okay, here we go. Here's a quote. I'm just reading from this page. On the concept of excuses or blessings. God, why didn't you do this for us? Why is this problem happening? And if we pray such things, why didn't you do this? Why is this happening? We shouldn't really be surprised when we get a response back to, I gave you the people, I've given you the resources, I gave you, Bill, Michael, listener, I gave you the gift to accomplish a specific task. You just had too many excuses not to use it or to use it. So, I think that's really the challenge, that Moses is really getting the reality check, first off, because it makes it clear. We're not going to go back too late into this episode, but it mentions destruction. He was literally facing the wrath of God. There's a verse, the anger of God, when you look up that Hebrew word, that's saying that God is really boiling, and Moses, you're either going to act or you're not, and if you don't, I'm sorry.
That probably leads us, if we want to go towards that, because we're almost at the end, to the devotional overview and then some takeaways for you guys, because I think it kind of goes in line with that. If we're looking at the devotional, I'll kind of walk you through what it went over for each day, but kind of Monday is that God does things in his own way and at his own pace, and we clearly see that starting, like, the devotional went all the way back last week, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and then they're 400 years in Egypt. And so he still has that same promise of, like, they are going to be my people, this nation that came out of Abraham. Tuesday in the devotional talked about the main character in the Bible is God, despite what you may think, despite your own favorite characters, was like, it is here to reveal the character and nature of God. And it's not stories about the people of God, but about the God of the people. So that is kind of like an interesting switch.
And I really like to reading that. I ended up underlining that in my book. I was like, thank you, because you don't hear that a lot. And anytime you hear these stories in a bunch of different types of books, devotionals, anything that talks about the Bible, you're always talking about the character. Which, granted, we've talked a lot about Moses, but
he is not the main character, you guys.
Right,
it's God.
Right. So I think we spend too much time talking about the individual characters and what they have personally done, rather than, like you said, God being that main character. He's the one that really gets the credit. He's the reason everything has happened. Now, that's my 2 cents on that. Go ahead and continue.
Yeah, and then within that too is God doesn't always take the easy route, and he works within and with messed up people, which you see, we're going to keep seeing for the this rest of this year.
Right.
Wednesday, God can use every circumstance to shape us into who we are supposed to be, and he values the process as much as the outcome. And what I liked in it, because I think all of this is very applicable, but how you get to the end of your life, which in the New Testament, like running the race, like you don't want to be like the kings in the Old Testament where they lived great, Solomon, and then what happened? He just,
right.
I think my brother-in-law said, hoard himself out and brought in all of these religions, and like it severely impacted even today, Judaism and like the people, but how you get there is just as important. How we get to the end is just as important that we get to the end, and how we get there is going to determine who we are as we get there. Yeah. And I've seen that a lot, even in my own business, and how you work within your job is like, you're going to get there to the end. We're going to get to death, but who do you want to be when you're there? And then finally Thursday was God delivered his people and wanted them to remember this. And all of the last chapters are, here's what you're going to do for Passover. Here is the unleavened bread festivity that you must do. You have all these rules, but what is it to do? It's for his people to remember him. And that's kind of how it ended with like, God has delivered us as well. Like, don't forget that. And we should remember that. And even I was thinking now in the New Testament, Jesus says, take this in remembrance of me, the communion. And
right.
like, we still, like, we're not killing the firstborn sheep and lambs and all of that. Like, thank God for that, because when I read that, I'm like, it sounds awful.
Right.
But we still have ways where we are to be remembering what Jesus did for us, that God has delivered us from Satan's grip, from hell. Like,
yeah.
Oh, thank God for that. And then kind of like, that's what we should be doing, remembering what God has done for us. But Bill,
right.
I'll take it to you for the takeaways in these last few minutes.
Well, yeah, and I think that aspect you talked about, I think I'm losing my train of thought right now. Looking back at what God has done, I mean, I think that's really the big key, the takeaway from this. And I think we talked a little bit about this last week, maybe the week before. I think we talked about it quite a bit. But to really look back on our lives is that with these excuses, one, there's no reason why we should have an excuse. And two, we have a God who has promised to be there for us, who is stronger literally than anything we could possibly do. He made a snake out of a piece of wood. He literally took down Egypt and all their false gods. And he was there personally with Moses. I mean, the literal direct affirmation of Moses, grow up, stop being a baby. You don't have any excuses. I've got your back. I mean, that's like a big brother, so to speak, or more specifically a father, so to speak, where, well, not so to speak, he is the father. But that, I know you're a little child. I know you're weak. I know you have limited understanding. But I don't. I have the experiences. I'm omniscient. I know what's going to happen. I know it did happen. In fact, I know what's going to happen 3,000 years from now. I've got it all planned out. This is something that needs to happen because there's a greater picture to come. So, I mean, there's so much that we can take away from this. But I guess the couple of questions I would ask, I'd ask the audience. One, what's stopping you from fulfilling your calling? What's stopping you from acting? What's stopping you from, like Moses, confronting Pharaoh? I mean, what's going to happen if you don't move, if you don't act? What's the potential that could happen? I mean, there's so much there, and these are something that only you know. This isn't something anybody else can answer, but one of the things I would recommend, in fact, I think I actually pulled this from the devotional. This last question I have, or a way in which we can remember these, what are ways in which we can remember what God has done? Yes, it was, because they were talking about a marriage. I think this would be very applicable. I think this would be something that all of us could do, however that might consist of, is like a couple who's getting married. They record their ceremony and they look back on it. You've got this VHS tape sitting in a cabinet somewhere, and
what's a VHS? No,
right? Yeah,
I grew up with those. I was there.
It's like an 8-track tape, but only new-ish. So yeah, I mean, do that. Write a journal. Take pictures and make memories, because it's not just the memories there. I mean, they are important, but to look through these things and, I mean, write down even your deepest struggles. I'm struggling with such sin, or I'm struggling with this person, or, whatever issue that might be. And 5-10 years from now, you can look back on that and be like, that whatever the issue is in my life, that's no longer in my life. And I have this written down because I know that it was God that has brought me through this. I know that it was God that was the strength through all of this. And if I did not have him, I wouldn't be where I'm at today.
Yeah, and I think for myself, I'll leave you guys with some encouragement kind of going along with that, because I think it was last year when we were going through this in church, and a verse that really stuck out to me was in chapter 14, verses 13. And it's right as the Egyptians are now coming after the Israelites. And they're like, shouldn't we have just stayed there? There are no graves out here. You wanted us to die in the desert. You know, like being melodramatic, dramatic, whatever you want to say, as always, as they will be. And then Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." And so I think that even as I read it now, I'm like, wow, that's such a good memory. Whatever the Egyptians are, the Egyptians in your life, that sounds a little cheesy, but just knowing like they were facing death, like a huge army's coming after them. And just to know like that's the same God of today. Like, right. I don't think we always put that together because our lives are so different. Most of us have never been to a desert. We don't know a lot of these things. But when you think of that, like he was in the fiery cloud and was dividing them so that they couldn't reach each other. Like all of these things are like, whoa, but that's the God in the Bible. Well, guess what, everybody? We have the same God.
Yeah,
I think
it's
that
still here.
Is like with whatever God's calling you to do is knowing that if he can do stuff like this, like he's the same. He doesn't change. He never will change. And so that as you look into the character of God, you see like, man, he can use me. He can use Bill. He can use you, the listener. Right. And I think that when you come to the hardships, is very encouraging to know, because I think as people were so easily turned to the side of, oh, it's scary. Like Moses, like he had so many, I can't speak, I can't do this. Do you really want me to start a ministry? Do you really want me to do this? Like, as you were saying, like, yeah. And he was like, yeah, I do. So I think that's what I'll leave it with. But I think that is just real good encouragement as we close this, of the God of the Bible is still our God too.
Yeah. And again, I had some thoughts on that, but we got to stop. We need to put a rule. You know what? That
you can put it in the outro though. We're very close.
I can. There's a loophole. So, all right. So yeah, that's all we have time for you guys today.
Thank you for listening to the show. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider supporting this ministry. You can do so in a number of ways. You can comment and rate the show. Your interaction will help us improve the show and also help others find us. You can share the show and ministry with your friends in order to help strengthen their walk of faith. And finally, you can support us financially by becoming a supporting member. Members will have early access to content created, as well as discounted or free material as a special thanks through our Patreon platform. And that's not all. As a supporting member, you have the chance of being invited onto the show as a special guest to share your own story. I'm Micah White, and this is Christian Cornerstone 412 Ministry Podcast.